The moment Eliza Harte rode into Dusty Creek on a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpetbag and a broken heart, every man in the territory could see she was the kind of woman trouble followed like a shadow, and not a single one of them was wrong. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Dusty Creek, nestled in the red rock country of southeastern Colorado, was the sort of place that swallowed people whole. The kind of town where the wind never seemed to blow in just one direction, where the saloon sat catty-corner to the church as though God and whiskey had long since made their peace, and where a woman arriving alone on a mule was enough to draw every curious eye from the general store to the livery stable. Eliza was 24 years old, dark-haired, sun-browned, and possessed of a stillness about her that most people mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has learned that screaming changes nothing. She had come from Pueblo, 2 days' ride east, where she had buried a marriage that should never have happened, and a grief so deep she had stopped trying to name it. Her former husband, Gerald Harte, had been a man of fine clothes and finer words and very little else. He had taken her at 19, full of promises about the life they would build, and had spent the next 4 years slowly dismantling everything she believed about herself. The worst of what he had done was not the coldness, not the cruelty hidden beneath his gentlemanly exterior. It was what he had told her when she could not give him the children he demanded. He had sat across from her in their parlor in Pueblo, very calmly, as though discussing a business arrangement that had gone sour, and told her she was broken, defective, that her body was a field that would not yield, and that he had no further use for a barren woman. The doctor had confirmed it. Something had gone wrong years ago, after a fever she had suffered at 16, and the damage, he said with practiced sympathy and no real feeling, was permanent. She would not carry children. She would not be a mother. She had absorbed that truth the way dry earth absorbs the first drops of rain before a storm, quietly, completely, without overflow. But Gerald had not given her the dignity of private grief. He had broadcast her condition like a town crier with no sense of decency, and by the time he had arranged for the marriage to be quietly dissolved, half of Pueblo knew that Eliza Harte was barren, and the other half had been told she was worse. So she had packed what she could carry, sold what she could not, and she had ridden west because west was what you did in 1878 when everything behind you was ash. Dusty Creek received her the way small towns receive strangers, with a mixture of suspicion and hunger for novelty. She found lodging with a widow named Mabel Prout who ran a boarding house above the seamstress shop and who asked no questions, which was the finest quality a landlady could possess. Within 3 days, Eliza had found herself a position at the Dusty Creek Hotel, helping with laundry and mending, and the occasional serving of meals to traveling men who passed through on their way to somewhere more important. It was honest work, and it kept her hands busy, which was all she asked of it. She had been in town for exactly 11 days when she first laid eyes on Cole Whitmore. He rode in from the northwest on a roan horse the color of cedar heartwood, trailing 2 more horses behind him on a lead rope, and he did not so much arrive as materialize the way certain men do in certain landscapes, as though the land itself had shaped them and finally sent them out into the world. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark gold hair gone to bronze at the ends from years under an open sky, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock that surrounded the valley. He wore a weathered hat, trail-dark clothing, and spurs that caught the afternoon light with every step of his horse. He was not the prettiest man Eliza had ever seen. He was something better. He was the kind of man who looked entirely real, no performance, no artifice, just a person occupying the space he stood in with complete and uncomplicated honesty. He was also the most stubborn, opinionated, infuriating person she would meet in the entire territory, but she did not know that yet. Cole Whitmore ran the Whitmore Ranch 6 miles north of town, a spread he had built with his own hands and his own back, and the occasional cooperation of his 2 ranch hands, a wiry Mexican man named Aurelio Vega who had been with Cole since the beginning and who possessed a wisdom Cole had long since learned to trust absolutely, and a big, quiet Scotsman named Duncan McRae who spoke rarely but worked twice as hard as any man Cole had ever hired. The ranch ran about 400 head of cattle and a small but excellent horse operation, and Cole had been slowly, methodically building it into something that would last. He was a man with a plan, and the plan was a good one, and the only piece of it that had so far failed to materialize was the part where someone shared it with him. It was not for lack of trying. He was not an undesirable man. The women of Dusty Creek and several of the surrounding settlements had made this very clear, but Cole had the particular misfortune of being both highly principled and completely honest, and those two qualities together tended to shorten courtships considerably. He came into the Dusty Creek Hotel that first afternoon because he needed a meal and a conversation with the hotel proprietor about a shipment of lumber he was waiting on, and it was Eliza who brought him his coffee. She set it down in front of him without any particular ceremony, and he thanked her without looking up from the letter he was reading, and that was the entire extent of their first interaction, unremarkable in every possible way. And yet, when she walked back toward the kitchen, Cole looked up from his letter and watched her go, and something in him went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the meal. He came back the next day for breakfast, and the day after that for supper. On the fourth visit, Mabel Prout, who was the town's most reliable collector and distributor of information, informed everyone at Sunday service that Cole Whitmore had eaten at the hotel 4 days running, which was notable because Cole Whitmore had not eaten at the hotel more than twice in any given month for the past 3 years. The congregation drew their own conclusions, which were mostly accurate. It was on the fifth visit that Cole finally said more than a thank you. Eliza had brought him a plate of salt pork and cornbread, and she had set it down and turned to go, and he had said, quite suddenly, "You're new here." She turned back and looked at him. "I have been here nearly 2 weeks," she said. "I imagine that still qualifies." "Where are you from?" "Pueblo." He nodded slowly, the way a man does when he is using a simple response to buy time for a more complicated thought. "What brought you out this way?" She looked at him steadily. She had learned in 11 days in Dusty Creek that honesty was the currency of small-town life and that evasion cost more than it was worth. "A fresh start," she said. The old one did not take. Something moved across his face. Not pity, she would have turned and left if it had been pity. It was more like recognition. "That's a fair reason," he said. "Cole Whitmore." "Eliza Harte." He extended his hand across the table the way a man might extend it to another man, and she shook it, which seemed to please him considerably. After that, he came in every evening, and the conversations grew longer, and the coffee she brought him grew more like a reason to stay than a thing to drink. And by the 3rd week of May, it had become an open secret in Dusty Creek that the two of them were in the early stages of something that the town had not yet found the proper word for. Cole was careful. He was not the kind of man who rushed, and he sensed, with an instinct honed by years of reading land and weather and animal behavior, that Eliza Harte had been handled carelessly before, and that any rapid approach would send her sideways like a spooked mare. So he went slow. He asked questions and he listened to the answers. He told her things about himself that were true and unglamorous, because he had no patience for the version of courtship that was essentially theater. He told her that he had built his ranch from almost nothing, that he had failed twice and recovered twice, that he had once cried over a horse he had to put down, and that he had no particular shame about it, and that he believed a man who could not admit to the full range of his own feelings was a man who could not be trusted. Eliza listened to all of this with the careful attention of someone examining a map of unfamiliar territory, looking for the false paths, the places where the ground would not hold. She found none, which terrified her more than finding several would have. She began, against her better judgment and the considerable advice of a self-protective instinct that had served her well for several years, to like him. Not the cautious, guarded half-liking she was capable of extending to the people she encountered from a safe distance, but the real kind, the inconvenient, full-bodied kind that sits in the chest and makes ordinary moments strange and luminous. He brought her wildflowers from the mesa one afternoon in early June. Not as a grand gesture. He handed them to her the way he might hand someone a useful tool, because he had seen them on his way in and thought she might like them. And this straightforward practicality was somehow more disarming than any elaborate romance could have been. She put them in a tin cup on the windowsill of her room at Mabel Pruitt's house and looked at them every morning while she laced her boots, and she recognized this as a problem. Cole began to take her walking on Sunday afternoons, when the hotel was quiet and the town softened under the late light. They walked the length of the main street and out along the creek bed, and the conversations they had were unlike any Eliza had experienced in her previous life. He talked to her as an equal, which was not universal in 1878 and was therefore remarkable. He asked her opinions, and he considered them seriously. When she disagreed with him about the best way to manage dry-season grazing, about whether the new territorial governor was likely to make good on his infrastructure promises, about the fundamental question of whether the cattle barons in the North were going to cause real trouble before the decade was out, he argued back with equal seriousness and no trace of condescension, and she found this thrilling in a way she could not entirely account for. In the third week of June, on a Sunday evening when the sky had turned every shade of copper and rose over the western ridge and the creek was low and bright and the cottonwoods were throwing long shadows across the red ground, Cole stopped walking and turned to face her, and he said, "I want to be plain with you." She looked at him carefully. "Go ahead." "I like you considerably," he said, "more than I have liked anyone in a long time. And I am not a man who says things he does not mean, which I imagine you know by now." "I do know it," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing. And I want to ask you that plain, not sideways, because you deserve to be asked directly." She was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved below them with its steady, soft sound, and somewhere in the cottonwoods, a pair of doves were having a conversation. She felt in that moment all the weight of what she was carrying, the thing she had not told him, the truth about her body that Gerald had used against her, the secret she had kept because it was the first piece of privacy she had managed to reclaim in years. "Before I answer you," she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. He did not look apprehensive. He looked attentive. "I cannot have children," she said. She said it the way you say a thing you have said before, practiced and flat, because the flatness was how she kept the bottom from dropping out of it. "I had a fever when I was young, and the doctor in Pueblo told me the damage was permanent. I will not carry a child. I have never been able to, and I never will be." The evening light lay golden across his face, and she watched it very carefully, reading him the way she would read approaching weather, looking for the exact nature of what was coming. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of discomfort, not the silence of a man searching for a polite way to exit. Something else. He looked at her with such complete and unguarded steadiness that she had to resist the impulse to look away. Then he said, "Eliza, that is the first thing you have told me about yourself that has nothing at all to do with whether I want to court you." She stared at him. He said, "I am asking because of you, because of who you are and how you think and how you stand in the world. Your body's capacity for childbearing is not a condition of my interest in you." He paused, and then he said something that she would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life in the quiet way one turns a stone, always finding something new in it. He said, "A woman is not a field to be judged by what she yields. She is a person, and you are a person I want to know better if you will let me." She did not cry. She had trained herself past crying over this particular thing because crying had not changed it and she was a practical woman. But something cracked deep in the bedrock of the wall she had built, and she felt the crack clearly, like the first split in a dam before the water finds its way. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that transformed a face entirely. Not the careful, social smile she had seen him use in town, but the real one, the one that reached everything. "Good," he said. "Then we had better head back before Mabel Prout sends out a search party." And they walked back along the creek as the last of the light left the sky, not touching, but close enough that their hands brushed twice, and each time neither of them moved away. The summer of 1878 in Dusty Creek unfolded around their courtship, the way summers do in high desert country, with great heat and sudden brief storms, and a quality of light so concentrated and clear that everything looked a little more itself than usual. Cole rode in from the ranch 3 or 4 times a week, and Eliza arranged her schedule at the hotel around his visits, in ways she did not entirely acknowledge to herself, and the town watched this with the particular warm satisfaction of a community that has been waiting for something good to happen and is finally getting it. Aurelio Vega, Cole's ranch hand, rode in once in early July and introduced himself to Eliza with great formality and told her, in his careful, accented English, that Cole was the best man he knew and that the ranch had been a lonelier place than it needed to be, and he hoped she would change that. He said this with absolute directness and no embarrassment, and Eliza was so charmed that she sent him back with a tin of cornbread cookies she had made that morning, which Aurelio reported to Duncan McRae upon his return was the best thing he had eaten since Christmas. Duncan McRae rode in the week after and said nothing about any of this, but removed his hat when he spoke to Eliza, and called her ma'am with a sincerity that bordered on ceremony, and this also constituted an endorsement. Cole took her out to the ranch on a Saturday in late July, which was a significant step. The ranch was his, entirely, the thing he had built himself, and showing it to someone was an act of disclosure as intimate as anything he knew how to offer. He rode alongside her on the road north, and when the ranch came into view over a gentle rise, the low stone house with its deep-set windows, the good solid barn, the corral where a half-dozen horses moved in the afternoon heat, the kitchen garden Aurelio tended with surprising devotion, he watched her face rather than the view. She took it all in slowly, with the careful attention she brought to everything. "You built this," she said. "Most of it," he said. "Aurelio built the kitchen addition. He has better hands than I do for stonework." "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant it with a directness that had nothing to do with politeness. She meant the land and the structure and the particular way it all fit together, the sense of something made with purpose and kept with care. He showed her everything. The barn with its good horses and its smell of hay and cedar. The kitchen garden where Aurelio had managed to coax tomatoes and beans, and 3 kinds of squash from the reluctant ground. The stone house with its one large main room that was kitchen and sitting room together, the small bedroom, the shelf of books above the fireplace that she stopped at for a long moment, reading the spines. History, mostly. Some practical volumes on land and animal management. A well-worn Bible. 2 novels that she would not have expected, one a French translation of something by Flaubert, and one by a woman whose name she recognized. "You read Middlemarch," she said, with an astonishment she could not keep out of her voice. "Twice," he said, without any defensiveness. George Eliot understood something important about what it costs people to live with less than they are capable of. "I found it useful." She looked at him across the room in the low afternoon light that came through the stone-framed window, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that she was in very serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble she had been in before. The good kind. The kind that rearranges the furniture of your entire interior life. They sat on the porch as the sun went down, and Cole made coffee on the stone hearth, and they talked until the stars were fully out, and the coyotes had started their distant conversation with the dark, and Aurelio appeared briefly to say the horses were settled, and to give Eliza a polite nod before disappearing back toward the bunkhouse with complete tact. And Cole walked her back into town in the warm dark, riding beside her at a slow pace, talking the whole way, and when he left her at Mabel Prute's door, he held her hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he looked at her in the starlight with that particular quality of attention that made her feel, for the first time in years, genuinely seen. "Good night, Eliza," he said. "Good night, Cole," she said. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a full 5 minutes before she remembered to light the lamp. And she thought about a man who had said a woman was not a field to be judged by what she yields. And she pressed her hand flat against her own chest and felt her heart doing something noisy and inconvenient. And she smiled at the dark for no one but herself. August in Dusty Creek was ferocious with heat, and the world shimmered and burned, and the cattle pressed themselves against the creek banks, and the townsfolk moved slower, and the tempers shortened, and the cold beer at the saloon became the single most popular commodity in the county. It was also the month that brought Randall Bowers to town. Bowers was a land speculator out of Denver, a man in his mid-40s with a well-dressed veneer over something considerably less pleasant, and he had come to Dusty Creek because the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was extending a spur line through the valley, and the land around Dusty Creek was suddenly worth 3 times what it had been 2 years ago. He moved through town with the practiced confidence of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through whatever combination of charm and pressure the situation required. And what he wanted, in Dusty Creek, was the Whitmore Ranch. Cole had received several letters over the spring and early summer from Bowers's land company, each one more generous in dollar terms than the last, and Cole had declined all of them with the same polite but absolute brevity. The ranch was not for sale. It had never been for sale. It would not be for sale. When Bowers arrived in person in mid-August, Cole received him at the ranch with the courtesy he extended to everyone and the firmness he reserved for situations that required it. Bowers sat in the main room and made his offer, which was substantial, and Cole said no, which was final, and Bowers left with the smile of a man who does not believe no is a permanent answer. Cole told Eliza about it that evening over supper at the hotel, with the matter-of-fact tone he used when he was genuinely unconcerned. But Aurelio, when Eliza encountered him in town 2 days later buying supplies, was less sanguine. "Men like Bowers," Aurelio said quietly, helping her carry her purchases back to the boarding house, "they do not take the first no as the real answer. I have seen this before. They find the pressure points. They push where things are already weak." "Cole will manage it," Eliza said. "I know he will," Aurelio said, "but it is better to watch." The pressure Bowers applied arrived from an unexpected direction 3 weeks later, when the county land office in Pueblo sent Cole a notice that there was a question about the northeastern boundary survey of the Whitmore Ranch. A question that had apparently materialized from nowhere, and that happened to cover exactly the parcel of creek-adjacent land that a railroad spur would need to cross. The notice required Cole to ride to Pueblo to contest the survey record in person, which would mean several days away from the ranch during the height of the late summer work. Cole was furious in the contained, cold way that was more alarming than shouting. He showed the notice to Eliza, and she read it twice and felt her own anger rise, clean and specific, because she recognized this particular tactic. She had watched Gerald use variations of it in business dealings, the manufactured complication, the paperwork designed to exhaust rather than resolve. "I will go to Pueblo," he said. "Can Aurelio manage the ranch in your absence?" she asked. "Aurelio can manage the ranch better than I can half the time," he said, with a grim half-smile. "It is not the ranch I am concerned about." "Then what?" He looked at her directly. "I am concerned that while I am gone, someone will attempt to use my absence to apply different kinds of pressure." She understood him. Bowers was not above finding leverage anywhere it presented itself, and the people Cole cared about were leverage. She was on that list. She was near the top of it. "I will not be intimidated," she said. "I know you will not," he said. "That is, frankly, part of what worries me." She managed, in the moment, not to find this as charming as she did. Cole rode to Pueblo at the end of August with a file of papers Aurelio had helped him assemble, and he spent 4 days in the land office making the case with the thoroughness of a man who had surveyed every inch of his own property with his own eyes and had the documentation to prove it. The county surveyor, a tired man named Henderson who had dealt with Bowers's company before and was approximately as fond of them as Cole was, ultimately ruled in Cole's favor. The boundary challenge was dismissed. Cole rode back to Dusty Creek with the paperwork and a cold certainty that Bowers would try something else. He was right, but not in the way he had expected. Bowers had not, in Cole's absence, approached Eliza directly. He had done something subtler and in some ways more insidious. He had spent those 4 days talking to people, not threatening anyone, simply talking, the way a man who knows how to move information can talk without appearing to do anything significant. He had, in various conversations at the saloon and the general store and the hotel dining room, allowed certain things to become known about Eliza Harte, where she had come from, why she had left Pueblo, the circumstances of her marriage and its dissolution, her inability to have children, framed in Bowers's telling as both a medical fact and an explanation for why Cole Whitmore, who needed an heir for his ranch, was making a poor decision. This was the calculus of cruelty that men like Bowers excelled at, the weaponizing of private pain, the deployment of a woman's most intimate grief as a negotiating tool in a land dispute that had nothing to do with her. Eliza found out the same day Cole returned, when she overheard two women at the dry goods store speaking in the careful half-voice of people who want to be heard without appearing to intend it. She understood immediately what had happened and felt a wave of something so complex and combustible it was several seconds before she could separate its components. Humiliation, anger at having her private truth used as a weapon, and something older and deeper that she refused to give the floor for very long. She walked back to the boarding house and she sat with it for exactly 30 minutes, and then she washed her face, put on her good dress, and went to find Cole. She found him at the stable, unsaddling his roan after the long return ride, still trail dusty and tired, and she told him plainly and calmly what Bowers had done and what was being said around town. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched the particular stillness that came over him, the way his hands went still on the cinch he had been loosening, and she saw, for the first and only time since she had known him, something that could properly be described as cold fury. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was entirely controlled, which she understood took effort. "I am angry," she said. Which is different from not being all right. Something in him shifted, not the anger that was still present, but something alongside it, something that looked at her with an attention so fierce and focused it was almost physical. "You are the bravest person I know," he said, "for what it is worth." "What I need it to be worth," she said, "is your promise that what is being said will not change anything between us." He looked at her with an expression of such direct and absolute certainty that she felt it land in the deepest part of her chest. "There is nothing to change," he said. "I told you that on the creek in June. I meant it then. I mean it more now because now someone has tried to use it against you and against us, and I want to be very clear on the other side of that attempt. I do not care what Randall Bowers thinks about your body or your history or your worth. I care about you. Those are not the same conversation." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, and the thing inside her that had been braced for impact slowly stood down. Cole dealt with Bowers directly the following morning. He walked into the hotel dining room where Bowers was having breakfast with the composed deliberateness of a man who has decided exactly what he intends to do and sees no need to rush it. He sat down across from Bowers without being invited, and he said, in a voice quiet enough that only Bowers could hear, that what Bowers had done with information about Eliza Harte was contemptible, that the ranch was still and would remain absolutely not for sale, and that if Bowers attempted to involve Eliza in any further land business through any means direct or indirect, Cole would make certain that every land office, county official, and legal authority in the Colorado Territory heard a detailed account of Bowers's methods. He said all of this without raising his voice, and when he was finished, he stood up and walked out, and Randall Bowers left Dusty Creek the following day. The town noticed. Small towns always notice. And the general judgment of Dusty Creek, communicated through the efficient network of Sunday services and store counter conversations, was that Cole Whitmore had handled himself exactly right, and that Eliza Harte had chosen well. What the town did not know, and what Eliza did not tell anyone except Mabel Prout, who could be trusted with a confidence the way a deep well can be trusted with water, was that she had gone back to her room after Cole's words in the stable and had cried for 20 minutes, not from grief or humiliation, but from the particular, almost unbearable relief of being defended with such complete and unconditional certainty. She was not used to it. She had not known to expect it, and it remade something in her that had been broken for a very long time. September arrived and painted the valley in gold and amber, and the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow and brilliant, and the air had the clean, sharp quality of high desert autumn that makes everything feel more immediate and alive. Cole and Eliza had settled into the easy, deep rhythm of two people who have stopped being cautious with each other and started being real, and the shift was visible to everyone who knew them. She had been out to the ranch a dozen times. She had cooked in his kitchen and ridden with him to check the fence lines, and helped Aurelio bring in the kitchen garden before the first frost. She had argued with Cole about the territorial governor again, and lost the argument on one point and won it on another, and they had both been more pleased by the argument than by any of the points. She was in love with him. She had known this since the evening on the porch in July when he had brought her coffee from the stone hearth and quoted, from memory, 3 lines of Middlemark that were exactly the right 3 lines. She had not said it yet because she was, in matters of the heart, constitutionally careful, and because saying it felt like standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom. But she knew it, and she was fairly certain he knew it too. Cole had known he was in love with Eliza Harte since the first Sunday walk in June, when she had argued with him about the territorial governor with such complete conviction and total absence of any inclination toward agreeing for the sake of agreeableness that he had felt something lock into place inside him with the clean, irreversible certainty of a key turning in a good lock. He had not said it either, for reasons of his own, largely because he was the kind of man who believed that certain words carried a weight that needed to be backed by action, and he was building toward the action first. On the 4th of September, a Thursday evening with a sky so full of stars, it looked almost burdened, Cole took Eliza to sit on the bench outside the church at the edge of town where the view was best, and he told her that he loved her. He said it without preamble and without the elaborate staging of it, just clearly and directly, looking at her face in the starlight. And she looked back at him and said, "I know, I love you too. I have for months." And he laughed, not the polite laugh, but the real one, the one that came from genuine delight, and reached over and took her hand. And they sat like that for a long time while the stars wheeled overhead, and the creek spoke quietly in the distance. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday in early October. He had not done it with a ring, because he had wanted to ask her first, before anything else. He brought her out to the ranch on the pretense of needing her opinion on the placement of a new water cistern, which was a real question, just not the only one he intended to ask. And after they had walked the property, and she had given her opinion on the cistern with the decisive practicality she brought to all things, he stopped on the slight rise north of the house where you could see the full sweep of the valley, and he said, "Eliza, I want to ask you something more important than the cistern." She looked at him with a quiet attention that held every shade of what she already suspected. He said, "I want you to marry me. Not because of the ranch or any practical consideration, though I believe we would build something extraordinary together, because you are the person I want beside me." because you are the most complete and genuine human being I have encountered in my life, and I want to spend mine with yours." She was quiet for what felt to both of them like a significant stretch of time, though it was probably 15 seconds. "There is something I need to say before I answer," she said. He waited. "You know I cannot give you children," she said. "You said it did not matter in June, and I believed you. I still believe you. But this is different. This is marriage. This is forever. And I need you to look at me right now and tell me that you have truly made peace with that, not as a courtesy and not as something you think you can manage, but as a real and settled truth. Because I will not spend another marriage being a disappointment." He held her gaze, and he did not look away for a single moment. He said, "Eliza, I have thought about this, not because I needed to talk myself into it, but because you deserve a man who has been honest with himself. And here is the honest truth. A house with you in it is a home. A house without you in it is just a building. I would rather have you and no children than children and not you. And beyond that, a family is what you make it. There are children in this world who need homes, and if that is ever something we both want to pursue, that door is not closed to us. But none of it is a condition. You are not a condition. You are the whole of what I want." She had her hands clasped in front of her to keep them still, but he saw them tremble slightly anyway, and he covered them with his own. "Yes," she said, in a voice that was everything and barely audible. "Yes, Cole, I will marry you." He held her hands, and she pressed forward, and he wrapped his arms around her, and she stood in the circle of his arms with the whole of the Colorado Valley laid out before them. And she thought with a wild and somewhat overwhelming clarity that she had ridden into Dusty Creek on a borrowed mule with a carpetbag and a broken heart, and had somehow, in the most improbable and perfect sequence of events, arrived here. At this. At him. They stood there for a long time, and the sun moved west, and the shadows of the high ridge crept across the valley floor, and a hawk circled slowly above the creek. And neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that the moment had not already said. They announced the engagement at Sunday service the following week, which produced an outpouring of genuine communal warmth that rather overwhelmed Eliza, who was not accustomed to being regarded with uncomplicated goodwill. The women of the congregation descended on her with the organized efficiency of people who have been waiting for something to celebrate, and within the week, the planning for what the town clearly intended to be a significant wedding was well underway. The preacher of Dusty Creek was a man named Reverend Eliza Abernathy, and he was the sort of man who came in different configurations than you expected. He was 62 years old, tall and thin, with a white beard and a manner that could be grave when gravity was called for and unexpectedly warm when warmth was needed. And he had been in Dusty Creek for 9 years, long enough to know everyone and to have earned the particular trust of a community that does not give trust easily. He was a man of genuine faith, which he wore quietly, without performance, and he had seen enough of life to have a clear-eyed and unsentimental understanding of what actually mattered in it. He called on Cole and Eliza together at the hotel one afternoon to arrange the ceremony, and he sat with them over coffee and asked them the questions he always asked couples, about their intentions, their understanding of what they were undertaking, the nature of the life they planned to build. He was thorough without being intrusive, and he listened to both of them with the same quality of complete attention that Eliza had come to associate with people who took human beings seriously. At the end of this conversation, Eliza said, almost without quite deciding to, it simply came out, the way things do when you are sitting with someone who creates genuine safety. "I want you to know, Reverend, that I cannot have children. I mention it because I want there to be no misunderstanding about the nature of this marriage, and because I have lived with this truth used against me once, and I prefer it known and plain." Reverend Abernathy looked at her with his steady, kind eyes for a moment. Then he looked at Cole, who was sitting with the straight-backed quiet of a man ready to defend any territory that needed defending. Then he looked back at Eliza. He said, "Miss Harte, in 32 years of ministry, I have joined a great many people together, and I can tell you with complete conviction that the happiest and most lasting of those unions were built on exactly what I see between the two of you, on real knowledge of each other, on honesty freely given, and on love that does not set conditions on its object." He paused, and when he continued his voice was lower and more deliberate. "What you carry is not a deficiency. It is a part of your story. And the fact that this man beside you receives that story with the regard he so clearly does tells me more about the character of this match than any other thing you might have said." He stopped, and Eliza realized that the Reverend's eyes were bright, not spilling over, but bright in the way of someone in whom something has been stirred to the surface by an unexpected force. He reached into his pocket for his handkerchief and touched it briefly to the corner of one eye, and he cleared his throat with the small authority of a man who is accustomed to managing his composure before an audience. "Forgive me," he said. "I have presided over a great many weddings. I do not always have the privilege of knowing I am helping to build something genuinely good." He folded his handkerchief and put it away. "I would be honored to marry you." Cole reached across the table and shook the Reverend's hand. Eliza, who had watched all of this with the particular wide-eyed stillness of someone who did not expect to be defended by 3 different people in 2 months, managed to say, "Thank you, Reverend," in a voice that was mostly steady. After Abernathy left, Cole looked at her across the table and said, very quietly, "He is right, you know." "He made you cry," she said. "I watched him." His eyes went. "Ministers are permitted to have feelings," he said. "He is not the only one," she said, and she pressed her fingers briefly against her own eyes, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The wedding was set for the 15th of November, which gave the season time to turn fully, and gave the town time to prepare, and gave Eliza time to have a dress made by the seamstress below Mabel's boarding house. A woman named Flora Chen, one of the few Chinese residents of the territory, whose skill with needle and thread was so far beyond the town's expectations that her shop had survived, and then thrived on pure merit in a climate that was not always welcoming to her. Flora made Eliza a dress in deep ivory cotton with an autumn-colored sash and simple embroidery at the cuffs, and it was, Eliza thought when she first saw it finished, the most beautiful garment she had ever worn. October spun out in bright cold days and spectacular sunsets, and Cole and Eliza spent as much of it together as they could manage between the demands of the ranch and the hotel. There was much to discuss and decide, practical things, the shape of their shared life, when Eliza would move to the ranch, and what that would mean for her employment at the hotel. She had already spoken to the hotel proprietor, a fair man named Mr. Holloway, who had expressed genuine warmth about the engagement and told her she was welcome back any time in any capacity, which she appreciated without any certainty that she would need it. She and Cole talked about the question of children, not in the raw and painful way she had been forced to discuss it in her previous life, but openly and honestly, and without either of them pretending the subject was simple. Cole had meant every word he said on the rise above the ranch. He had thought about it carefully and honestly. And he told her, one evening in early November when they sat together by the fire in the ranch house after supper, that he had been doing some quiet inquiry into the question of children who needed homes. "There are orphanages in Pueblo and in Denver," he said. "I have written to inquire. Not because I need to, and not because I am trying to fix something that is not broken, but because I wanted to know what was possible." She looked at him across the fire. "What did you learn?" "That there are a great many children who have lost their families," he said. "Families lost in the wars, to illness, to poverty. Children who are in need of exactly the kind of thing we have." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought we might, when we are settled, give it serious thought." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the November wind had started up in the pines, that particular sound like a distant ocean that is one of the loneliest and most beautiful sounds in the world. "You would want that," she said. "Really." "I want a full life," he said, "with you in it, whatever shape that life takes." She reached across the space between them and put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own. They sat like that for a while, with the fire going and the wind outside and the warmth of the room around them, and Eliza thought about what it meant to be loved by a man who did not flinch from the full weight of a life. The 15th of November arrived with a sky so clear and blue it looked like something from a picture book, cold and brilliant and absolute. The whole of Dusty Creek turned out. This was not an exaggeration. The hotel closed for the morning, the general store closed, even the saloon observed a midday quiet that its proprietor, a philosophical man named Walt Greer, described as a wedding gift. Mabel Prout had organized a reception at the hotel dining room with a thoroughness that suggested she had been waiting for this specific occasion for years, which was not entirely wrong. Eliza stood in the small room behind the church and looked at herself in the small mirror Flora Chen had brought and thought that she did not entirely recognize the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked different, the dress was beautiful. Her hair was pinned up with the small set of tortoiseshell combs she had inherited from her mother, and she looked, by any objective measure, well. But the expression on her face was unfamiliar, open, unguarded, the expression of someone who has decided to trust the ground beneath her feet. Mabel appeared in the doorway and said, with great feeling and very little warning, "You look absolutely wonderful." And then she pressed her lips together and turned back toward the church with the determined composure of someone who had promised herself she would not weep before the ceremony. Cole was at the front of the church with Reverend Abernathy when Eliza came in on Aurelio's arm, because she had no father living, and because Aurelio had been, without either of them quite saying so, the closest thing to family Cole had, and therefore the closest thing to family she had too. Duncan McRae stood beside Cole with an expression of profound solemnity that was his version of great happiness. Cole's face, when he saw her come through the door, did something that she felt from the entire length of the aisle away. It went completely, utterly open, all the composed steadiness stripped down to something unfiltered and total, and she walked toward it the way you walk toward a fire when you are cold. Reverend Abernathy had written their service himself, which she had not known. He began with the standard words of opening, the words that had been said over every wedding in the territory for decades. But then he turned to something that was entirely his own, and his voice carried through the small church with the quiet authority of someone speaking from the truest place he knew. He said, "Marriage, in the sight of God and in the experience of those who have undertaken it with their whole hearts, is not a contract between two people who are perfect. It is a covenant between two people who are real, who see each other clearly in all the fullness and complexity of what they are, and choose each other anyway, not despite what they carry but with full knowledge of it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything." Cole was looking at Eliza through all of this with an expression that had never been on his face in all the years Reverend Abernathy had known him. And Abernathy, who had meant every word of what he said to the two of them in the hotel that afternoon, felt it all rise up in him again. All the years of joining people who were making the right choice and the wrong choice and all the choices between, and the clear, rare, unmistakable quality of watching two people choose each other with complete and unsentimental sincerity. He reached the vows. Cole's voice was steady and clear. He said everything that was written, and then he said something that was not written, because he was Cole Whitmore and he could not leave the most important things to someone else's words. He said, "Eliza, I want you to know that I see you, all of you, and everything I see is what I want, for as long as I live." She was holding his hands and looking at his face, and she said her vows with the full weight of every word, and when she reached the end she said, quietly for him rather than the congregation, "You are the most unexpected thing that has ever happened to me, and I will spend my life being grateful for it." Reverend Abernathy, who was 62 years old and had seen more of the world than most, and who had conducted over 100 ceremonies in the full range of human emotional weather, pressed his handkerchief to his eyes with an apologetic clearing of his throat. And the congregation, who had been watching all of this with very close attention, produced a general sound of communal warmth. Mabel Prout abandoned all pretense of composure. Flora Chen, seated near the back, folded her hands in her lap and blinked at the ceiling. Even Duncan McRae, who expressed everything through stoic quietude, was found afterward to have a suspiciously reddened quality around the eyes that he attributed, without any credibility, to the cold air. They were married under that clear November sky, in a small stone church in Dusty Creek, Colorado, in the year 1878, with the whole of the town watching and the preacher's eyes bright with feeling, and the future stretching out before them like the valley at sunrise, full of all the promise and difficulty and extraordinary ordinary beauty that a real life contains. The reception at the hotel dining room was everything Mabel had made it and more. Walt Greer from the saloon had contributed 3 bottles of his best whiskey, which he delivered personally and with great dignity. Flora Chen had baked something extraordinary involving almonds and honey that everyone ate and no one had a name for. Aurelio danced with such skill and abandon that a space was cleared and people simply watched him, which he seemed entirely comfortable with. Duncan McRae played a fiddle that no one had known he owned, and the sound of it filled the room with something ancient and bright at the same time. Cole danced with Eliza in the center of the cleared space, and he was not, by his own cheerful admission, a skilled dancer, but he held her with such complete and deliberate care that the lack of technique did not matter at all. She rested her forehead against his jaw for a moment during a slower piece, and he pressed his hand flat against her back and held her closer, and around them the room went on being warm and full of people who meant them well. They rode out to the ranch in the late afternoon, under a sky going gold and then deep rose along the western ridge, the horses moving through air that smelled of pine and cold stone. Aurelio and Duncan had, without being asked, made certain the house was warm and the kitchen was stocked, and had then removed themselves to the bunkhouse with what Aurelio later described, with great dignity, as appropriate discretion. The ranch house in the evening, with the fire lit and the lamps burning, and the two of them alone in it for the first time as a married couple, had a quality of settled rightness that Eliza felt in her bones. She stood at the kitchen hearth making tea with the same ease she had in every other kitchen she had ever worked in, and Cole sat at the table watching her with an expression of such unguarded contentment that it stopped her for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She brought him his tea and sat down across from him, and they drank it in the easy quiet of two people who have nothing to prove to each other, with the fire going and the wind outside and the whole long good life ahead of them. The winter of 1878 into 1879 settled over the valley with the severe, beautiful austerity of high desert cold. The snow came in December and turned the red rock country white, and made the ranch a world unto itself for days at a time. And Cole and Eliza discovered in those long quiet stretches the particular pleasure of being genuinely at home with another person. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the morning feeding, the fence checks, the endless practical problem-solving that running a spread required. Cole learned, or rather had confirmed, that Eliza had a capacity for hard work and practical thinking that matched or exceeded his own, and that she was constitutionally incapable of doing a thing halfway. She took over the kitchen garden planning from Aurelio, who relinquished this duty with an expression of transparent relief, having managed it out of necessity rather than inclination. She wrote to a seed supplier in Denver and ordered varieties she thought would do better in the altitude and the clay soil. She reorganized the pantry in a way that Cole described as a revelation. She fixed the broken hinge on the barn door that had been broken for 2 years because it was never quite the most urgent thing, and she did it herself one afternoon with a kit she had borrowed from Duncan, who watched her work from a respectful distance, and told Cole that evening that he had married exceptionally well. In January, Eliza wrote to the orphanage in Pueblo that Cole had made inquiry with. She wrote carefully and at length, explaining their situation honestly. The ranch, their circumstances, her inability to bear children, their sincere desire to provide a home. She asked what the process involved and what children were currently in need of placement. The letter took her 3 evenings to complete, because she rewrote it twice to make certain it said exactly what she meant, no more and no less. The response came in late February, carried up on the supply run from town, and she read it alone at the kitchen table before Cole came in from the morning work. The orphanage director, a woman named Sister Margaret, had written back with warmth and practical detail. There were currently 11 children in the Pueblo orphanage, ranging in age from infant to 12. Sister Margaret had noted Eliza's letter in particular, she said, because its honesty and specificity spoke well of the people who had written it, and she invited them to come to Pueblo in the spring to meet the children and discuss placement seriously. Eliza held the letter in both hands for a moment, and then she put it on the table and walked out to where Cole was repairing a section of fence along the east pasture, and she handed it to him without saying anything. He read it standing in the cold morning air, and when he looked up his face had that particular expression she loved, the one where everything he was feeling was exactly visible, without any management of it. "In the spring," he said. "When the pass is clear," she said. "Yes." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket, and then he pulled her to him in the cold air and held her, and she pressed her face against his coat and breathed the smell of cold and pine and the particular warmth of him, and she felt something she had stopped believing she would feel, the sense of a door opening onto a room she had been told did not exist. Spring came to the valley in mid-April, slow and uncertain at first, and then with a sudden conviction that turned everything green and made the creek run high and cold and bright. Cole and Eliza rode to Pueblo in the last week of April with the pass clear and the day warm, and they arrived at the Pueblo orphanage on a Tuesday afternoon and were received by Sister Margaret, who was nothing like what Eliza had imagined from the letter, and exactly what the letter had implied, a compact, practical, quietly fierce woman in her 50s who had been running the orphanage for 12 years, and who looked at Cole and Eliza with the careful assessment of someone who took her responsibility to the children in her care with absolute seriousness. She showed them through the building, which was clean and well-organized and crowded in a way that spoke of too few resources and too many children, and she introduced them to several of the children with a naturalness that allowed the children to be themselves rather than performing for prospective parents. Cole crouched down to talk to a 7-year-old boy named Henry, who was deeply invested in explaining the mechanics of a wooden wagon he had made himself from scrap wood, and Eliza watched Cole listen to this explanation with complete and genuine interest, asking questions, examining the craftsmanship, and she felt her heart do something so large and immediate she had to breathe through it. There was a boy of 4 named Thomas, small for his age, with serious dark eyes and a habit of watching before engaging, who had come to the orphanage 8 months earlier after losing both parents to typhoid. He had been sick himself when he arrived, Sister Margaret said, and had recovered, but the experience had left him quiet and watchful in ways that made some prospective families hesitant. He had been passed over twice. He came and sat near Eliza while she was talking to Sister Margaret, not close enough to be obtrusive, just near. And when she glanced down at him, he looked back up at her with those serious dark eyes and did not look away. Most children, meeting a stranger, look and then look away. Thomas held her gaze with the grave, evaluating directness of someone who has learned to make careful judgments about people. "What is your name?" she said. "Thomas," he said. "I am Eliza." He considered this. Then he said, "Do you have horses?" She looked down at him and felt something settle in her chest with the irreversible certainty of something clicked into place. "We have 7 horses," she said. "One of them is particularly fond of carrots." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I like horses." She looked across the room at Cole, who had finished his conversation with Henry, and was watching her and Thomas from a distance with an expression she recognized immediately. The same expression she had seen on the rise above the ranch in October, looking out over the valley. The expression of someone who sees exactly what they want. They spent the afternoon at the orphanage, and they had a long conversation with Sister Margaret about Thomas and about the process, and about what would be required. And they stayed in Pueblo 2 more days to complete the initial paperwork and meet with the relevant county authority. And they rode back to Dusty Creek with a growing file of official documents and a date in late June by which, if everything proceeded as intended, Thomas would come to the Whitmore ranch. Eliza spent May preparing. She converted the small storage room off the main bedroom into a proper child's room, with Cole's help. A real bed instead of a pallet, a set of shelves for books and the things a boy accumulates, a window that looked out toward the horse pasture because Thomas had asked about horses and she had not forgotten. Cole made a small wooden horse, working at the kitchen table in the evenings, which he carved with more patience and skill than he had claimed to have, and which turned out, by the time he was finished, to be a genuinely fine piece of work. Aurelio, who had no children of his own and had been waiting for this with a quiet eagerness he expressed in practical terms, built a small wooden chair and table for the child's room that fit a 4-year-old's proportions exactly. Duncan McRae contributed a wool blanket he had ordered from a cousin in Edinburgh, thick and warm, and the color of dark heather, that Duncan said would last the boy for years, which, knowing Duncan's assessment of material quality, was an understatement. Thomas arrived on a Wednesday in late June, delivered by Sister Margaret herself, who had made the trip to verify the placement and who walked through the ranch house and the property with the thorough, unsentimental assessment of a woman who trusts but also verifies. She pronounced herself satisfied. She hugged Thomas goodbye with a brevity that Eliza recognized as the only way to do an impossible thing, and she rode back toward Pueblo with the composed efficiency of a woman who had important work waiting, and who trusted that this particular child was in good hands. Thomas stood in the ranch yard with his small carpetbag and looked at the house and the barn and the pasture beyond and the horses moving in the late afternoon light, and he was entirely quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Which one likes carrots?" Cole crouched down beside him and pointed to a bay mare in the far corner of the pasture. "That one there. Her name is Comet, though she is not particularly fast. She simply moved like one when she was young." Thomas watched the mare for a moment. Then he picked up his carpetbag with both hands and said, "Okay," and walked toward the house. Eliza watched him go, a small boy with serious eyes walking toward the door of his new home, and beside her Cole straightened up from his crouch and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and she felt the whole of it, the full, improbable, extraordinary weight of this moment, move through her like something bright. The summer of 1879 had a quality of abundance that felt, to both of them, almost more than they had been prepared for. Thomas was a careful, watchful child who revealed himself slowly and in layers, which suited Cole and Eliza's particular form of patience. He asked excellent questions about everything. He had an unexpectedly dry sense of humor that emerged, over the first weeks, like something that had been waiting for a safe environment in which to unfold. He was devoted to Comet the mare, who received his daily carrot offerings with the gracious condescension of an animal who considers herself entitled to tribute. He called them Cole and Eliza for the first 2 months, which they did not push against, understanding that he needed time to find his own way toward whatever these relationships would be. Then one morning in September, quite without ceremony, he called Cole Papa while asking about the fence repair, and then continued the conversation as though he had not just turned the world over, and Cole stood very still for a moment before answering the question, and Eliza, who had been within earshot, went into the kitchen and stood at the window for 30 seconds with her hand over her mouth. 3 days later Thomas called her Mama, also without ceremony, also in the middle of a completely practical exchange about what was for dinner, and Eliza responded naturally and immediately, and then went into the garden, where she stood among the end-of-summer tomatoes and looked at the sky for a long moment and felt something so complete and whole-bodied that she had no adequate name for it. She wrote to Sister Margaret to tell her that Thomas was thriving. Sister Margaret wrote back to say she was glad, and that Thomas was in excellent hands, and that there were 8 other children in Pueblo who needed exactly what Thomas had found if the Whitmore Ranch ever found itself with more room. Eliza read this letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at it for a while. She was still looking at it when Cole came in from the evening chores, and he read the expression on her face with the ease of a man who has spent a year learning a person's particular emotional vocabulary. "She mentions the other children," Eliza said. "How many?" he said. 8. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and leaned against the counter. "We cannot take 8, he said. "No," she agreed. "The house would need another room," he said. She looked at him. "Yes. Duncan is good with stone," he said. She felt the smile start somewhere in her chest and work its way up. "He is," she said. "He told me himself." Cole set down his cup and came to the table and sat down across from her, and they looked at each other with the clear, steady eyes of 2 people who understand each other completely. "How many do you think we should consider?" he said. "1 more," she said. "To start." "To start," he agreed. They wrote to Sister Margaret in November, and in the spring of 1880, a 6-year-old girl named Clara came to the Whitmore Ranch. She was small and quick, and had red hair and an opinion about everything. And Thomas, who had initially regarded the prospect of a sibling with the deep suspicion of a child accustomed to being alone, decided within 48 hours that Clara was acceptable, and then, within a week, was teaching her the particular route through the pasture that allowed the best approach to Comet's preferred carrot-receiving spot. Dusty Creek received all of this with the warm, proprietary satisfaction of a community that had invested in a love story and was now watching it pay dividends. The Reverend Abernathy, who had taken to stopping at the Whitmore Ranch once a month on his circuit, would sit on the porch with Cole and Eliza and a cup of coffee and watch Thomas and Clara chase each other around the yard or argue over something in the kitchen garden. And he would have, Eliza noticed, the same quality of bright-eyed feeling he had shown in the hotel that afternoon when she had told him about her inability to have children. As though something in the full picture of what had grown from that moment confirmed something he had believed his whole professional life, but was always grateful to see made literal. One afternoon in the fall of 1880, with the cottonwoods gone gold again and Thomas now 5 and Clara 7 months into being part of the family, Abernathy said, "You know, when people ask me why I do this work, I never know quite what to say that is not either too small or too large, but I think I will tell them about you two from now on." Eliza looked at him across the porch railing. About a woman who could not have children and a man who did not care. Abernathy smiled and his eyes went bright. "About a man and a woman who knew what love actually was," he said, "and built a life according to it." Cole reached over and found Eliza's hand without looking, and she curled her fingers around his in the easy, natural way of people for whom this gesture has become as reflexive as breathing. The ranch continued to grow through the early 1880s. The cattle operation expanded with a profitable deal on longhorn stock from a rancher down near Trinidad, and Cole and Aurelio brought on 2 more ranch hands to manage the additional head. The horse operation, which had always been small and excellent, developed a reputation that brought buyers from as far as Denver, drawn by the consistent quality of the animals Cole bred and trained. Duncan McRae, whose stoneworking skill had been deployed to build the additional room for Clara and would be needed again, as the family considered their future, had become something more than a ranch hand. He was a fixture, a part of the household, and he and Thomas had developed a particular friendship based on the shared qualities of careful observation and very few unnecessary words. Aurelio, for his part, had in the spring of 1881 introduced a woman named Rosa to the extended family of the ranch, a widow from a homestead south of town, who raised chickens and grew the best chili peppers in the county. The introduction, made at a Sunday dinner that Eliza had organized and that managed to feel both festive and unstudied, went extremely well, and by the summer Aurelio and Rosa were keeping steady company, and by the following spring they were married in a ceremony at the same church where Cole and Eliza had been married, with the same reverend presiding and with a considerably more practiced control over his own composure, though he admitted to Eliza afterward that it had been a near thing. Thomas, by the summer of 1882, was 7 years old and had developed into exactly the kind of person his earliest careful observation had suggested he might be: deliberate, curious, fair-minded, devoted to horses with a single-mindedness that Cole regarded with the pleasure of a mentor who sees his own enthusiasm reflected and improved upon. He had also, in the previous year, developed a close friendship with a boy his age in town named Miguel, the son of a Mexican family who had been in the valley for 2 generations, and the two of them conducted their friendship with the absolute intensity of 7-year-olds who have found a genuine equal. Clara was 8 in 1882 and was in the process of demonstrating that she intended to have opinions about everything and apologize for none of them, which delighted Eliza and made Cole laugh in a way she loved, the full, unguarded laugh of a man who is genuinely surprised by joy. Clara had decided she wanted to learn to read from the best possible source, which she determined, after some investigation, was the Reverend's collection of books, and Reverend Abernathy had accordingly been recruited into a Tuesday afternoon reading program that he clearly found as satisfying as she did. The question of a third child came up naturally, in the way that questions come up naturally between two people whose lives are genuinely shared. In the fall of 1882, Thomas was settled, happy, entirely himself. Clara was thriving in the expansive and emphatic way that was entirely her. And there was room, not just the physical room that Duncan had built, but the other kind, the room that a family with love and stability and real resources and a genuine commitment can make. They wrote to Sister Margaret again in November. Thomas and Clara both knew about the letter Eliza had told them plainly, because she believed in plain telling, and Thomas had received the news with the careful consideration of a serious person, and Clara had immediately begun drawing up a list of acceptable names. Sister Margaret's response arrived in January of 1883, and it contained information about 2 children, a pair of brothers, 5 and 7 years old, who had come to the orphanage together after their mother's death, and who had so far refused, quietly and collectively, to be separated. Sister Margaret wrote that she had hoped and been unable until now to find a family capable of taking both, and she asked whether the Whitmore household might consider it. Cole and Eliza read this letter together at the kitchen table, and then they looked at each other across the morning coffee, and Cole said, 2 at once. Duncan would need to build another room, she said. He will not mind, Cole said. He would deny minding, she said. Which is the same thing, Cole said. The 2 brothers, named James and William, arrived in April of 1883 and were received by a household that had, with considerable practical love and some skillful advance preparation by Thomas and Clara, made itself ready. James, the older at 7, had a protective stillness about him that Eliza recognized immediately, the particular quiet of a child who has learned to be the responsible one. William, at 5, was warm and loud and enormously funny, with a laugh that filled the entire house, and that immediately made Aurelio declare him the most valuable addition to the ranch in years. Thomas took both brothers under his 8-year-old wing, with a gravity and generosity that made Cole find something very interesting to look at on the middle distance once or twice. Clara, at 9, organized everyone with an authority that no one quite understood how she had acquired, but that everyone found themselves obeying. By June, the 5 children were a unit complicated and loud, and requiring the constant management of 4 adults who were all, in their different ways, devoted to them. And the ranch house, expanded now by 2 of Duncan's stone rooms, and enlivened by the constant motion of 5 children and the regular presence of Aurelio and Rosa and their infant son, was exactly what Cole had once described to Eliza as a home rather than a building. Reverend Abernathy rode out in July of 1883 for his monthly visit and sat on the porch and looked at the controlled chaos of the ranch yard, Thomas leading James on a patient tour of the horse paddock, Clara explaining something to William with great authority, and a stick she was using as a pointer, Rosa hanging washing while her baby slept in a basket in the shade, Duncan repairing something with the measured efficiency he brought to everything, Aurelio's voice floating out from the barn in the particular singing tone he used when he worked, and he sat with his coffee cup and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I think about you 2 more than I probably should." Cole looked at him. "Is that so?" "I have been a minister for 32 years, Abernathy said. "I have seen a great deal of what human beings do to each other and for each other, and I will tell you plainly that what I have watched the 2 of you build here is one of the finest things I have ever had a front row seat to." Eliza was sitting on the other side of Cole, and she leaned slightly forward. "You always say something that makes me need to compose myself," she said. "It is an occupational skill of yours." He smiled, and his eyes went bright in their familiar way. "Consider it my reciprocal gift," he said, "since yours has been considerable." The afternoon sun came down warm and golden on the ranch yard, and the sounds of the children and the horses and the ordinary industry of the place rose and fell around them, and Eliza looked at Cole and Cole looked at Eliza, and in that look was everything: the mule ride into Dusty Creek, the first coffee, the wildflowers handed over like a useful tool, the creek bed in June and the words about fields and what they yield, the preacher's bright eyes in the hotel dining room, the vows in the cold November church, the serious dark eyes of a 4-year-old asking about horses, and all the days since, all the mornings and the hard seasons, and the ordinary extraordinary gift of a life genuinely shared. She reached over and took his hand, and he brought it to his lips briefly, and then they sat together on the porch of the ranch they had built as 2 people, and were now filling as something much larger and more various and more alive. And the Colorado sun laid its late afternoon gold across everything: the red rock and the good horses and the growing green of the kitchen garden and the 5 children making their particular joyful noise in the yard. And it was, by any honest accounting, more than either of them had once believed they were allowed to want. But then, Eliza thought, that was the thing about arriving in a place broken and being received by something real. You stopped counting what you were allowed. You started counting what you had. And what she had, on this July afternoon in 1883, was a husband who had told her she was not a field to be judged by what she yielded, and had spent every day since proving that he had meant it in the fullest and most expansive possible sense, who had taken her grief and her truth and her history, and held all of it without flinching, who had built beside her and with her, and for her, and who reached for her hand in the middle of an ordinary afternoon as naturally as breathing. She had 4 children who were hers in every way that mattered, who called her mama and drove her half to distraction, and whom she loved with a ferocity that still sometimes surprised her with its depth. She had Mabel Prout, who had asked no questions when she needed it most. She had Flora Chen, who had made her a wedding dress and was now making Clara a dress for the fall church social with the same impeccable skill, and who had become, over 5 years, a genuine friend. She had Reverend Abernathy, who wept at the right moments and said the right things and kept showing up. She had Aurelio, who had told her from the start that Cole was the best man he knew and who was right, and who was now family in the fullest sense of that word. And she had this ranch, this valley, this particular quality of afternoon light over red rock country that she had come to believe was the most beautiful light in the world. Cole turned and found her looking at him and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He smiled, the real one, the one that reached all the way and tightened his grip on her hand. And from the yard came the sound of William's enormous laugh at something James had said, and Clara's voice raised in explanation, and Thomas's lower, steadier tone, and the horses moving in the pasture, and Aurelio's song floating up from the barn, and the wind coming down off the high ridge with its smell of pine and cold stone, and all the wide open country beyond. Eliza Harte Whitmore had ridden into Dusty Creek 5 years ago on a borrowed mule with a broken heart and a carpetbag, and she had found there, against every reasonable expectation, the full life she had been told she was not built to hold. It turned out that was not how life worked. Life did not yield itself to the grief of the men who tried to measure you. Life yielded to something else entirely, to the particular courage of honesty, to the specific and irreplaceable grace of being truly seen, and to the kind of love that looks at everything you carry and says, "There is nothing here that changes my answer." The Reverend was right, as it turned out. Not about all things, perhaps. He was a man, and men are not right about all things. But about this, it was everything.